Hello everyone, we're going to get started now. Welcome to LD at School's third of 4 webinars for 2014-2015. My name is Shannon Malik-Stroini and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Funding for the production of this webinar was provided by the Ministry of Education. Please note that the views expressed in this webinar are the views of the recipient and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education. The LD at School team is very pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Colin King, who will be speaking to us this afternoon about supporting the social and emotional development of students with learning disabilities. Just to let everyone know, all webinar participants except for the presenter have now been muted for the remainder of the presentation. Once Dr. King has finished his presentation, we will be opening up the floor for questions. Over the course of the presentation, if you would like to ask any of the LD at School team a question, you may enter your text in the box at the bottom of the control panel and choose to send it to the staff from the drop-down menu underneath. Also, we will be tweeting throughout the webinar, so if you would like to take part, you can send us a tweet. Our Twitter handle is @LDAtSchool, which is displayed at the bottom of the slide. After the webinar, we will be sending out presentation slides as well as a link to provide us with feedback on the webinar. In approximately 3 weeks, the webinar recording will be available and we will send out a link to all participants. So that takes care of all of our housekeeping for this afternoon, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Colin King. Dr. Colin King is a psychologist and the acting coordinator of psychological services in the Thames Valley District School Board. He is actively involved in various initiatives with special education and in providing assessment, counseling, and consultation services. Dr. King has trained and worked in a variety of community, hospital, and mental health settings with children and adolescents experiencing learning, behavioral, and social-emotional difficulties. He serves as an adjunct professor of psychology at Western University and is engaged in graduate student training and supervision. Welcome, Dr. King. The cyber floor is now yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Shannon, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. This is an opportunity to talk about a topic that is certainly near and dear to my heart, as I'm sure it is for many of our listeners and participants on the webinars. And it's an area and a topic of focus, I think, that is as important, if not more important at times, than academic success. So very much look forward this afternoon to walking you through the presentation. What I would like to do to start is, as we think about supporting the social and emotional development of students with learning disabilities, is I would like you to kind of set your intention for this afternoon. So what I would like you to do before we start is think about a student with a learning disability who you currently support. And that might be a student that you're supporting in your role as a special education teacher in the classroom. Perhaps it's your son or daughter with a learning disability that you're supporting at home. And what I would like you to think about is think about those skills related to social emotional development. You know,
sorry, Colin, just to interrupt you just for a second. Can you just make sure that your screen is showing for all participants? I think I can send you that request again. Okay, great. Are you able to press the share screen button? Okay, so it should be on your control panel.
Okay, I've pressed it there.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Okay, great. So it does show that you're showing it. I'm sorry, it just looks like a delay with GoToWebinar today, so I apologize in advance. Thank you.
That's okay. Great, so let me minimize this here. Great. So again, thinking about the student who may be struggling with their social emotional development skills, I'd like you to think about, again, with that student in mind, what is your definition of social emotional development? And perhaps thinking a little bit more specifically about what skills does this student that you're thinking about require to be successful? And that's successful in a school context, home and community context, and in a future academic success content. And as you're thinking about this student right now, and we're thinking about social emotional development, there's often a range of common ideas that maybe might be coming to mind. So perhaps you're thinking about the realm of friendships and relationships, their ability to get along with others and be able to get along in a group. Perhaps you're thinking about some of the choices they make, about being able to make good choices and being able to pause and consider a range of choices before they respond to situations. Perhaps you're thinking about self-esteem and confidence and their ability to think about themselves as a person in kind of confident, organized way. Looks like my screen is a little bit, looks like I'm, oh, there we go. Perhaps we're thinking about managing emotions and being able to regulate those emotions, whether that be aggression, frustration, or anxiety. Perhaps we're thinking about social skills and all the complex skills involved in navigating and managing social relationships. Or lastly, perhaps one of the things that came to mind is around mental and social emotional well-being and thinking around that umbrella. So as we kind of start out on our presentation for today, I would like to have a bit of a common ground that we can come together and think about social emotional development. And one of the definitions that I like to think about is from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or sometimes referred to as CASEL. So this, the CASEL guide often talks about social emotional learning, or SEL. So they talk about social emotional learning as the process through which children acquire the knowledge, attitudes, and skills that they need to do a whole host of skills, such as recognize and manage their emotions, demonstrate caring and concern for others, establish positive relationships, make responsible decisions, and handle challenging situations in a constructive manner. So that's certainly the definition and the umbrella that they provide that I'll be thinking about today as we talk about our students with learning disabilities. And one of the areas that they often present and talk about is talking about social emotional learning or social emotional development as social emotional competencies. And we'll have a chance to go through each of these 5 areas a little bit more in depth to talk about, again, really the range of skills that are embedded in these competencies. And really these are a host of interrelated competencies that really kind of reinforce each other as well. So if we think about the first competency there, and that's around self-awareness. And really that's a whole host of skills that really recognize that it's the student's ability to recognize their own emotions and thoughts and how this has an influence on their subsequent behavior. It also includes competencies and skills around being able to assess your own strengths and limitations, to have that balanced perspective of what you're good at and what's challenging, and to have kind of a well-grounded sense of confidence, optimism, and self-esteem. So that would certainly fall within that self-awareness umbrella. The second competency that the CASEL, or again, Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning, talk about is around responsible decision making. And this is, again, a whole host of skills that's really the ability to make constructive and respectful choices about their own behaviors and social interactions, considering a range of different factors around ethical standards, safety concerns, social norms, a realistic understanding of consequences of their actions, and their own well-being about themselves and others. When we think about relationship skills as a competency, again, this is a whole host of different skills related to navigating relationships, about establishing and maintaining healthy and rewarding relationships, not only with select individuals, but with diverse individuals and groups. It includes a whole host of skills related to communication, active listening, cooperating, resisting some of that inappropriate or difficult social pressure, negotiating social conflict, and seeking help when needed. Thinking about a fourth competency here, social awareness, is really the ability to take the perspective and empathize with others that they know and others from diverse backgrounds and cultures. It's about understanding social and kind of ethical norms for behaviors, and recognizing resources and supports in their family, school, community, and being able to understand that other point of view and perspective. And the last one here is thinking about, again, that fifth competency within this certain framework is about self-management. And this is, again, a range of skills relating to regulating one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. It includes managing stress, controlling impulses, self-motivation, setting goals and working towards that goal, and being able to self-monitor about how that process is going. So as we think about our students with learning disabilities and, again, these competencies and the skills beneath them, we can see how many of our students would struggle in not only one, but perhaps kind of multiple areas and competencies. And this really leads us to our first kind of poll question that we're going to talk about today. It's a chance for you to participate and share what you believe might be the case here. But it's the first poll question is about looking at the percentage of students with learning disabilities who are at risk of developing mental health difficulties. So I'm going to launch some different options here, and I'd like you to take a second and respond either individually or as a group as to what you think might be the case. So thinking of it, again, our students with LDs, is it 10% who are at risk, 20% at risk of developing mental health difficulties, 40%, or 50%. So again, if you could just take a moment there and kind of select your best choice there. Great, wonderful. Great, so certainly it looks like here in just reviewing some of the results there that certainly the people who are participating today have a kind of key knowledge of some of those struggles of students with learning disabilities. So the most prominent option here is 45% of you did select 40%. Another percentage, 40% of you indicated about half of students with LDs will struggle. And 15% of you selected 20%. And interestingly, no one in the audience group selected 10%. Great, and we'll talk about some of the results there in just a moment. Thinking about our second poll question here, again, what percentage of students with learning disabilities will struggle in their social relationships? Again, I'm going to present four options here. I would like you to participate. Again, is it thinking about 30% of students, 40%, 50%, or is it 75% of students? Again, if you could just take a moment there and select your best guess. Wonderful, thank you. Great, and as we review just quickly the results on this poll as well, again, this is a very knowledgeable group. 40% of you indicated that about half of students with learning disabilities will struggle in the kind of the social relationship realm. A third of you selected 75%, and fewer respondents selected 40 and 30% there. So thank you for the opportunity to participate that way, because I think we all know that students with learning disabilities do struggle in the social emotional development and realm. And some of our best kind of estimates from our research, whether that be journal articles, some of our meta-analyses, that way is we do know that about approximately 40%, and that can be higher in some samples and studies, will struggle with mental health difficulties. Again, thinking about mental health as a broad umbrella where there's those who are struggling with their mental health who may not meet criteria for a specific mental illness but may be struggling, but also including those who are meeting criteria for a mental health disorder such as anxiety or depression. So we do know that it's a very kind of common experience. And some of our best research looking at the social realm suggests that about 75% or 3 out of 4 students will struggle in their social relationships, again, for those with learning disabilities. This is something that is clearly very prevalent and very significant for our proportion of students with LDs. And what I would like to do before we delve into a little bit more of the content is think about some of the mechanisms or the pathways that our students with learning disabilities are put at risk. And sometimes we think about kind of a primary or secondary kind of pathway, knowing that, again, students with LDs may be struggling for a whole host of reasons, but 2 of the primary pathways that I'll talk about today, the primary being kind of struggling as a result of a contribution of their learning disability, so it's a direct kind of consequence. And the second pathway being more of kind of a secondary consequence, that's by nature of having a learning disability that they struggle in some of these other areas. I'll have a chance to go through each of those. So thinking about the primary pathways, thinking about the contribution of learning disabilities, and that's where when we think about some of the impact of their processing deficits, that some of those challenges that manifest in the academic sense will also manifest or impact in the social and emotional realm as well. So for example, I'm just thinking about a student I supported recently who is struggling some of their processing difficulties, again, very bright student, but struggling in their working memory and processing speed. So this student had difficulties holding on to multiple pieces of information in their head, and also struggled with the pace and the timing of processing information. It often came much too quickly. And so as we think about, again, some of the pathways from a primary contribution pathway, some of these same difficulties that impact the academic context will also impact in the social emotional realm. So thinking about it, again, as a result of having slower processing teams, certainly needing more time to process information in an academic classroom context. And what that would translate like into the social relationships and social world is about more time to really read and process social cues, process a lot of that conversation and input that's coming in. So certainly that, again, that pathway, the skill that's getting in the way of the academic context certainly impacts some of those social skills as well. Thinking about, again, a result of having weaker working memory and slower processing speed, it made this student more vulnerable to be impulsive in class and rushing to get the information out before they forgot it. And when we look at, again, what that looks like in a social emotional realm and world as well, it certainly looks like that he was impulsive and had difficulty in some of those social relationships, again, wanting to share information before it fell out of his head that way. And thinking about, again, just as a third skill that way, again, all the difficulties associated with remembering information for the student, whether that be in a working memory context or in a long-term memory retrieval context as well, we can think about a whole host of different situations where those same difficulties with remembering information would get in the way in a social emotional impact as well, whether that be difficulty around remembering names, about all the different components of what we're going to be doing as part of an activity, and being able to remember all those pieces that often occur in conversation and navigating social relationships. So often that's thinking about a primary contribution. Again, those same processing deficits that impact academics are going to translate in a social and emotional arena as well. When we think about a secondary pathway, it's more of a consequence of having a learning disability. So thinking about ways in which a student with a learning disability is made more vulnerable to having social emotional problems because they have a learning disability. And we can think about 2 main areas there, again, about emotional development, and studies show that students with learning disabilities do struggle with around self-esteem and self-concept, often do struggle with anxiety and low mood and depression. struggle with low motivation, and some of those attributions around success, that when they achieve success, that it's due to external factors as opposed to intrinsic personal factors that way. So we know that's often the case, again, because they often have to work so much harder and experience more difficulty, that they are at more risk for some of those difficulties in emotional development. We also know, again, from studies thinking about social development, that students with learning disabilities are made more vulnerable to be not as connected or feeling as socially competent as some of their peers, feeling like they're stigmatized or feeling like they're different than some of the other students in the classroom. And certainly some of the research would indicate that as well, struggling with connectedness, about the quality of the relationships, and about how skilled or how competent they feel in navigating the social realm. So I want to set the stage a little bit as we talk about just some of the key ideas as we think about promoting these social and emotional skills, knowing, again, students with learning disabilities are at greater risk of struggling in these areas. And some of the key ideas that I'll be talking about this afternoon, I'm also borrowing from Learning for All. So this might be a guide that is familiar to many of you in the audience here, but it's a resource guide that really builds on some of the guiding principles that was outlined in the Education for All report that looked at literacy and numeracy instruction. And Learning for All really describes the educational approaches that are based on some of the most important findings in educational research since really the year 2000 and beyond, is that all students learn best when instruction, resources, and their environment are well suited to their strengths, interests, and needs. And we'll be talking about some of the components that really are contained within this guide, and there'll be a link at the end of the webinar to this resource as well. But the Learning for All guide talks about three main concepts that we'll be borrowing from this afternoon. The first element that I'll be talking about is about personalization, and that's really putting the student and learner at the center of everything we do, so that our approach, our assessment, our instruction is tailored to the student's particular learning skills, motivational needs, social emotional skills, and it's providing that flexible learning that allows the greatest amount of learning and development to take place. The second concept there is around precision, is that how we do things and what we're doing in terms of instruction, our supports in the classroom are precise to that particular student. That it may look very differently compared to the student sitting next to them, and that's okay, because what we're doing in a particular situation is precise depending upon that student's needs. And you'll see again some of the relation to the ideas we'll be talking about. The third concept there is around professional learning, and this is really the idea that it's ongoing learning, not only for every educator, but I would say every parent and every support professional as well, that's linking new ideas to how they help students. And again, we'll be talking about these elements as we move forward. As we're thinking about developing social emotional skills, we often talk about, I feel sometimes more so than academic skills, is we often talk about longer term outcomes. So we talk about wanting students to feel confident and have a healthy amount of self-esteem. We often talk about wanting students to know how to be effective self-advocates and to know themselves. We often talk about students wanting to have social competence and being able to work well in groups. The challenge I think sometimes we really run into, though, is that we don't break these skills down in a way that really allows us to build on them sequentially in an organized and developmental fashion, knowing that the skills that are needed to perhaps be an effective self-advocate really start much earlier on, and that we need to really often back it up and work on some of the very specific skills that perhaps are missing before we can get to that later stage outcome. And that's something you'll see and embedded in some of the ideas is about the idea of really being precise and thinking about where the student's struggling and starting from that standpoint. So that's something I just want to talk about, because often we talk about, we don't think about the same way with academic skills. So we often break it down when we're thinking about, for example, reading comprehension and the host of skills that are related to that skill ability, or math problem solving. Yet sometimes with social emotional success, we don't think about it in the same manner. Thinking about strategies for helping and promoting social emotional development, we do know that strategies are really essential to help students with LDs develop their mental health and well-being, that we need to be providing these skill strategies to support them along in the way, as some of our numbers suggested earlier. We also know that the classroom and the school environment are really ideal environments, locations to really be practicing and learning these skills, that there's a host of opportunities throughout the day when we can practice, use, receive feedback on learning some of these skills. Yet when we think about some of the how ideal the environment is, and yet sometimes our challenges with implementing strategies and working on these skills, is that there are some constraints and challenges that do come up. We often think about time, that we don't have, we're pressed for time to be able to make this perhaps a focus as part of our work, and perhaps we need to be focusing more on academic success first before we get to social emotional well-being. Perhaps it feels overwhelming, and often I hear this from parents, is perhaps their student with a learning disability is struggling in a whole host and range of competencies, as described by Castle, that perhaps there's areas in each of those 5 competencies where they may be having difficulty and we don't know where to start and working on that. And certainly that's that third one, uncertainty about if I was going to go about working on these skills, I'm not exactly sure how I'd go about beginning that process. And hopefully this webinar will, afterwards you'll have a little bit more idea or some wonderings about how to take this and apply this to the student that you're supporting, whether that be in a classroom sense or at home as a parent or guardian. So 3 of the main principles that I'll be talking about for the remainder of this talk really fall under kind of 3 main umbrellas. The first one being around learning disability knowledge and education. The second tenet being about specificity. It's about really digging deep and getting to know and understanding the skill that we're working on and what that looks like in a certain context, and where the student may be struggling, where that skill's breaking down. The third one is about developing a plan that is realistic and manageable and is doable as well. So I'll be referring to these 3 ideas as we continue throughout our talk here. So thinking about our first one here is about learning disability knowledge and education. Is that this is such a fundamental area and competency that we often talk about, yet it's often frequently overlooked, I feel. So we know that learning about one's own learning is not only important for students with learning disabilities, but really important for all of us as adults to know ourselves, what our strengths are, and where our areas of challenge and limitations are. But I would say it's even more important, if not essential, for students with learning disabilities. And that process about learning about one's own learning, whether that be a learning disability and learning style, is helpful on a number of different avenues, whether that be around the stigma about learning disabilities. So talking about it more frequently and in an open manner will help reduce some of that stigma that's associated with it. It's so important as part of developing strategies that often it's hard to know what strategy you need if you don't understand how the strategy is going to be helpful and how it fits in with your overall learning profile, and why it makes sense to use a particular strategy. And it's so important as part of developing more appropriate or knowledgeable attributions that we know students with learning disabilities will often misidentify or misattribute their success. So often success is seen as something that's random and due to external factors as opposed to something that is because I worked hard and it's something that I own, that's success. So we know there's a lot of misidentification that goes on as part of that process and that struggle with learning. And being able to help students with learning disabilities move from I feel stupid at times to I have a learning disability, which means that I struggle in some areas, but I'm a smart kid who has good ideas, that can do wonders as part of that social emotional well-being. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Learning about learning disabilities, or sometimes called demystification. It really consists of a number of skills and areas around, for example, what is a learning disability? Really taps into what are some of those areas of strength and challenge. From that, what are some of those tools, strategies, and planning that can help their student? And often it's around those processing deficits and how they get in the way. But it's also about having a positive outlook, a hopeful outlook that is realistic, so it doesn't take away some of the challenge and difficulty that's associated with having a learning disability, but it has a positive outlook that with the development of a plan and some supports, create some of that optimism and hope for the future. And I'd like to give credit here. So this is an example of one advocacy card. And this particular advocacy card, the credit for this really goes to Julia Osborne. She's an intermediate special education resource teacher in the York Region District School Board. And her and the York Region Learning Disability Steering Committee developed a whole manual and program really designed to help students with learning disabilities understand their own profile of strengths and challenge and strategies and accommodations that will be helpful. And in many ways, looking through this, it almost looks like an IEP for a child. So you can see as part of this example here with Julia, it outlines, again, this is how I learn in terms of some of those strengths, being a hard worker in math, like reading about certain topics, good ideas when writing stories, yet also capture some of those difficulties, again, whether that be writing down, paying attention, and listening. And just on the back of that card, again, a great example here of what that might look like for a child is, again, some of those strategies that are helpful not only in a class sense, but in a social area. So for example, out on the playground here, and if you look under the playground column, you can see some things that are helpful about needing some help finding a group of friends to play with, some help following rules, and some help managing emotions as well. And some other ones there around turn taking and accessing help. So again, I just wanted to include this because I thought this was a wonderful example that Julie and her LD steering committee have put together as a way to help students develop some of those self-advocacy and social emotional skills. The second main idea that I want to talk about today is about being specific about the skills. So again, going back to our castle graphic that we talked about at the beginning with the 5 areas of competency, this area is really, in skills, really about digging deep to have a sense of what that skill looks like and being able to describe it and to know exactly what we're working on as part of that, our process to support the student. So as we talked about, some of the social emotional development we know relies on a number of interrelated skills, whether that be cognitive, social, some of these essential developmental skills that they're developing along the way. And in order to do that, again, to support them where they're at, we really need to have a precise and personalized plan that is really designed for that unique child in mind. So again, you'll see some of those ideas from Learning from All embedded in there, but we really need to be quite precise and personalized about the plan that we're developing, and that the plan we're developing for this student may not be applicable directly to a student with a learning disability beside them, because again, it's going to be unique and tailored to them. We also know around working on specific skills that just as we're patient and using a positive approach working on academic skills, that we have to have that same lens and standpoint. So I'm going to go back just a couple of slides here, thinking about specificity and working on these skill competencies we know really relies on a host of interrelated skills, and that's why we really need to be very precise and personalized with the student in mind as we're thinking about supporting their social and emotional well-being. And just as we would within an academic context, we really need to have that patient and positive approach as we're working on these skills. So some of the questions that I'd like you to think about as you're thinking about the student in mind here that you're thinking about at the beginning of the webinar is thinking about what is that particular social emotional skill that we want to be working on and developing? How is it impacted by their learning disability? And what does it currently look like? And that's where it gets into questions around being able to describe it according to different conditions, whether that be at home, at school, across different classrooms. Again, what does it, if you're observing, if you're standing in the corner of the room, what would that skill or situation look like there? And to consider for many students with learning disabilities, is it a knowledge or a performance weakness? We know that students with learning disabilities, it's sometimes not a knowledge deficit. They know what they should be doing in some situations, but it's a difficulty with implementation. It's about doing it in the moment. Whereas some students with learning disabilities might need some of that more foundational knowledge and education to be able to show it. So there's some of those questions that we need to think about. So just using one example here about a student struggling with the relationship skills, again, that's much too broad a competency for us to really be effective and precise in supporting the student. And again, it could mean a whole host of different skills, whether that be initiating or maintaining friendships, navigating some conflict, turn-taking and problem-solving, some of those challenges that would be experienced, or navigating social experiences, perhaps moving from one group to another group. And again, thinking about relationships is much too broad a term, and we need to be very specific about the skill that we're observing and where we need to provide some of that support. And the third principle here is about developing a manageable plan. Again, to take away some of those barriers that are often experienced about it being a time-intensive endeavor, about not knowing where to start. Developing this plan is so important. So some of the things that we want to think about in this area is thinking about our timelines and our goals. Think about how difficult it is for this skill to be acquired, who's going to be involved. Again, what are some of the ultimate goals that we're working towards, and then backing it up. Again, to be quite precise about those goals, what we're working on. To think about some of our feedback mechanisms. Again, how are we going to recognize and celebrate some of those improvements in those skills? How are we going to recognize some of that success? Has the student had a chance to provide input in terms of this plan? Again, how are we going to collect some of their feedback as we're working on the skill as to whether it's working or needs to be modified? And lastly, thinking about prioritization as well as an important concept about, again, thinking about those 5 broad competencies and being interwoven and knowing that there may be multiple competencies that we're working on. How do we select that first skill that we're working on? And often some of my recommendations is thinking about a meaningful goal, but that's not the most challenging skill that we're working on. Again, we want to experience success and work from a place of positive success. So how do we select something that is a realistic or first step goal as part of that process? And what I'm going to do is walk through one example here, a case study, thinking about these 3 main ideas or principles in mind so that we can see how this might apply here. And again, so as we're thinking about developing this plan, I want you to think about timelines, prioritizations, and incorporating some of those feedback mechanisms. So the student that I'm thinking about here, for the sake of this webinar, we're going to call him Casey. And Casey is a student that I've had the chance over the last 2 years to be supporting the school as we're working on some of the social emotional skills, along with the academic skills as well. So thinking about Casey, some of the initial concerns when I became involved was really around some help seeking and asking for help. So here was the comment from the teacher, and perhaps this doesn't sound too unusual given the students you work with as well. So Casey doesn't ask for help in class. He sits in class and becomes frustrated, and then he interrupts the learning of others in the classroom. And if we continued that kind of narrative by the teacher would also say that it then spills into the social landscape. So we're at recess and lunch as well, where some of that conflict would continue, and occasionally Casey would end up being sent home and be suspended if he ran into real difficulties that way. So I selected this example because this was a really good situation and opportunity for us to gather more information and working on a plan that is collaborative with the student, specific, again, is personalized and precise in a way that's meeting Casey's strengths and some of their social emotional needs. So again, going through our three main ideas here and principles, let's kind of look at that. So the first area again here being around their LD knowledge and education. So we know that Casey was first diagnosed with a learning disability in grade 3. Again, when I became involved, he was in grade 5 at the time. And if you ask Casey what his understanding was around learning disabilities, he had some kind of vague ideas, knowing that it meant that he learned differently, but he really didn't have a strong understanding of what that meant for him in terms of the classroom, about how that skill profile impacted his academic work, and certainly what some of his strengths were as well. And for Casey, it was a number of different areas, but primarily around working memory, about being able to hold multiple things in his head and ideas and a piece of information while he was doing something else. So that certainly got in the way of math problem solving, reading comprehension were the two main ones, certainly writing as well. Again, working memory has quite a kind of diverse impact. As we think about our second main idea here about skill specificity, that statement there about not asking for help in class, this was a real opportunity for us to dig deeper and be very specific and targeted about what that looked like. And when we had the chance to, again, to kind of scratch the surface and really do some investigation and describe what that looked like across his courses, it did look like he did have more challenges asking for help in his English classes and in math. When you looked at some of the other classes, though, that he worked in, it sounded like he did ask for help sometimes, however, particularly in science. So there was something about unique to science that made that perhaps an easier environment or skill to be working on. And actually, when we looked at math and really tried to pull that apart as well, it was actually kind of a qualifier that actually there were times when Casey would ask for help in his math class. As part of working with Casey, what came out was that some of his worries about being different from his peers, about feeling like he wouldn't know anything, about worry about being made fun of, really made asking for help difficult as well. So that was some really important information there, again, as we're developing a personalized and precise plan that we need to think about and recognize. And some of the feedback from his teachers were that I think Casey would have he would get less frustrated in his classes if he was able to recognize some of those challenges a little bit earlier, as opposed to later on when he was really kind of in the midst of the assignment. So going to our third main principle here about developing a manageable plan, again, some of the things we're thinking about prioritization, timeline, incorporating feedback. So as we're putting together a plan in place working on this very specific skill about help seeking, we decided that rather than math class right now, we were actually going to work on some of the difficulties asking for help and managing some of that frustration in his English class. So that seemed like a reasonable first step for us to be able to work on, and was seen as less or perceived as less challenging by Casey than math class. Again, going to that first main idea there about LD knowledge, we had the chance to really recognize and talk about with his classroom teacher about how his difficulties with working memory impacted his work, about really getting in the way of reading comprehension, his need to reread information, and to be able to keep all that information in his head, and the amount of time and effort he had to put into that particular area. And really, again, as we're thinking about that plan, really recognizing how challenging that skill is for him. And in order for us to be able to work on this skill, we really need multiple opportunities for us to begin to practice it and chance to build on that skill base. Again, putting together a plan, what Casey ended up providing a lot of input was, what he felt most comfortable as a first step was reviewing some of his work, and then he would then ask for a signal for help. So again, with that lens of catching those difficulties a little bit earlier, Casey still wanted some of that independence and opportunity to really kind of look at some of the work. So chance to look at and review the work first, and then think about asking for help. So some of the possible future goals, we didn't put this as a primary goal, but down the road, one possible help-seeking goal was around asking for help verbally in class, so being able to raise his hand, say that he's not understanding the question or the task, and being able to solicit some help in working on those skills. And what that looked like, again, thinking about feedback and timelines, was again, thinking about a manageable chunk there. We didn't want this to go on forever, but we decided that we'd work on this skill, this plan, for 3 days, and then have the opportunity to review and collaborate and talk about how this plan was working. So again, going back to, again, just that first comment here, again, not asking for help in class, since in class becomes frustrated and then interrupts the learning of others. We really need to, again, go through these different skills, think about these different principles, really to develop a plan that is personalized and precise for Casey. And without, in doing so, that will give Casey a much greater likelihood and chance that we can work on those skills, as opposed to some of the things sometimes that we say around, we want him to be an effective self-advocate and ask for help. So for Casey, and again, our students with learning disabilities, we really need to break it down and work on those skills at an individual level for us to be able to build on them along the way. Again, just go to the last page here. And again, that 3-day time window really gave us a chance to see, is this something that the skill's being mastered and we can up the next skill challenge, or is it something now that we actually need to go back and modify? So again, Casey, that goal was for him to review the work first and then ask as a signal for help. Perhaps it's a task that's too challenging for him, and we need to back it up even more, and perhaps thinking about instructions for the task. Maybe that's where we need to start. But for Casey, this was an initial first step that was a successful way for us to begin that process of working on some of those social emotional skills. So as we come to, and we'll have the opportunity for questions and some participant feedback that way, but I hope you can kind of leave the webinar here today thinking about social emotional development and social emotional learning as a host of competencies, and thinking about these competencies as involving a whole host of interrelated specific skills, and that by digging deep and including student voice and being quite descriptive about the skill we're working on, that we can begin to really provide that tailored and explicit instruction that we know students with learning disabilities need to be successful down the road. So thank you for the opportunity here to begin to talk about this topic, and I did want to include a couple references from the things that I mentioned today around Learning for All. Again, that's a great read not only for educators but certainly parents as well, as I think about providing some of that tailored support, but a great resource as well about the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. There's a lot of great resources on there that I would certainly direct participants to. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and look forward to navigating some questions.
Great, and thank you so much, Dr. King, for presenting such an interesting and important topic to all of our participants today. So if anyone has any questions, please click the raise hand button on your control panel to be unmuted to ask a live question to Dr. Colin King, or type your question into the chat box on your dashboard and I will read your question aloud. Okay. All right, so it looks like we have a few questions coming in right now. Okay, so the first question that I have is from Janice. So Janice asks, hi, how do I help my teenager who has dyslexia and dyscalculia with test anxiety? She has extra time to finish her tests, but still rushes through them to just get the test over with. Thanks.
No, great. Well, thank you, Janice. So that's a great question, and I think it's an experience that many students with learning disabilities might struggle with from time to time. So I think this is a great area there for us to, again, use some of the ideas from the webinar today about really kind of delving deep. So I think about, again, being specific. So I would really be curious about what test anxiety looks like and feels like for her. So getting some more information about, is it all types of tests? Is it open-end? Does it involve written tests, or is it around multiple choice? When does some of that anxiety kick in? Is that before the test? Is it really during, where she's trying to rush and finish up? And again, how does that kind of manifest or impact? Is it more about some of that, those worried thoughts that are rushing through her head? And again, what's that worry, or that, what is she imagining as part of that? Is she imagining perhaps needing extra time and students laughing at her, or is she imagining failing the test? Or is it more that physiological element about being so kind of uncomfortable during that test taking that that she wants to get that over with? So I'd really use that lens of delving deep to understand what that looks like, and then begin able to map on some strategies and a plan kind of moving forward. So I think about lots of opportunities to practice. Perhaps writing tests, and maybe that's just from home, again, doing some kind of exposure and mimicking kind of test experiences. And there's a great actually website that I would direct Janice to as well, and that's www.anxietybc.com. So that's a www.anxietybc.com, and there's a tab there for youth and young adults that goes into a whole host of strategies related to kind of more some of the cognitive worries, that physiological experience of anxiety, and also breaking down. So if you need to break down that plan or that exposure even more. So I think that's a great place to start, again, with that idea that we're going to develop a plan that is really specific to her experiences of test anxiety.
Great, thanks, Colin, and that was such a wonderful answer. Okay, so I see one from, we have a two-part question here. So the first part is there a connection between low self-esteem and mental health issues?
Okay. Certainly, I think if you would interview many students with learning disabilities who might be struggling with their confidence, I do think that it might make you more vulnerable at time to experiencing mental health difficulties, and thinking about certainly common to both kind of low mood and anxiety are some of those cognitive distortions, or some of those ways of thinking that might make you more at risk. So if you're kind of struggling with low self-esteem as a and you also have a learning disability, that might make you more vulnerable to, again, having anxiety and being worried about experiences, because you're not able to perhaps generate some of those more positive or realistic cognitive appraisals quickly, or to have a store of rebuttals to kind of those worries. And same with kind of low mood as well, that if students, we know that might experience thoughts about not being as good as other people, or worries about nobody liking me and feeling that it's not going to get any better, that if they've struggled with some of those cognitions as a result of having a learning disability, it might make you a little bit more vulnerable. And certainly some of our statistics around students with learning disabilities would suggest that there is a case, that there is a connection between kind of those two ideas.
Right, so thank you for answering that. And here's the second part. So how can teachers differentiate between self-esteem concerns and mental health concerns?
Well, that's a great question. I certainly think that for many educators, that umbrella, again, figuring out, is it related to kind of self-esteem and confidence, or is it about mental health challenges? I think, again, using some of the ideas today, being descriptive, gathering information and feedback is, I think, really important as a first step. I think connecting and collaborating with parents, knowing that school is one part of the equation for sure, but certainly the home piece and connecting with parents and their perceptions and feedback will give you a lot more information as well. Again, is this something self-esteem connected to an academic sense, or is it some of those mental health challenges that are perhaps in a number of areas that way? And that's where certainly there's a number of guides and resources that have been put together as well, and the one that comes to mind is Supporting Minds. And perhaps that's something we can add to our resources when we send out the webinar links there. Supporting Minds, it's an educator's resource that really looks at mental health and some of those kind of look-fors and some of those other information there that will help educators decide, is this something connected to mental health? So I'd really suggest, again, gathering more information, being descriptive and feedback, talking with other teachers, getting parents on board, and then developing a plan to talk about, to talk with the student as well, and having them be a partner as part of your plan, and talking about what you're observing in a tentative way, in a curious way, about how can we be of kind of further help and support. In working on kind of what you're seeing. So knowing that this is that differentiation against self-esteem and mental health challenges is very difficult for many of us to be able to kind of tease apart. So I think having all hands on deck is a great first step. So.
Great, and that's great advice. I do have a question from Janet asking about the last slide put up with the links on it in terms of the references, I believe.
Okay.
So Janet, we are going to be sending out the slides tomorrow morning, Dr. Colin King slides, so that will also include the reference slide with all of the links, so not to worry about that. Okay, so I do see another question here. And that is, so you talked a lot about how students can be impacted by the relationships with their peers. Is there anything I, as a teacher, can do to help with this development of relationships as their teacher?
No, that's a great question, and I think that real kind of positive stance is really welcome, because I think there are a number of opportunities there. Again, thinking about relationships, and I guess kind of my first question would be around what aspect in that competency around relationship skills do we want to be kind of working on for this particular kind of student? Is it again about making friends? Is it about once friendships and activities are established, kind of maintaining that, or is it about navigating some of that conflict? So I think about that particular competency, again, being specific about what they're struggling with, what will give you a lot of information and help guide that first step. I would say about, as a general kind of idea, again, without knowing a lot more, but I'm thinking very intentionally about setting up social situations and social success. So I think about being explicit and very intentional about the group of students that the student is being paired with in terms of their groups, in terms of the activities they're working on. Think about perhaps some ideas about being explicit in the types of roles that they're working on in a group. And again, perhaps for a student with a learning disability, being the recorder or the collector of information is perhaps maybe not a good task for their profile of strengths and needs, but maybe they can be the timer, maybe they can be someone who starts off the brainstorming process. Perhaps it's someone who supports some of the materials that we're using. So I really kind of back that up and think about what their learning disability kind of looks like, and setting up some of that, again, relationship success, about how can we set up that the student to be successful, and whether that be in the classroom or out on the playground. And yeah, and again, without knowing a lot more, it's difficult to know exactly where to go, but I think gathering more information, thinking about their learning disability, and being very intentional about groupings, about roles, and if it needs to be some one-on-one support, again, student paired with an individual buddy or a helper as a first step. Perhaps that's an area where you go, again, as a first step of working on some of these skills.
Great, another excellent answer. Thank you so much, Colin. So it looks like we just have one more question left. So that is, are there commercial programs that teachers can use to promote positive social and emotional skill development?
No, that's a great question, and that's something that particularly in school boards across Ontario and North America now, looking at some of the evidence-based and evidence-informed programming is something that we're always very mindful of. So what I would direct to that question is actually back to that reference there around the Center for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, and they actually have a guide on there, so it's called the CASEL Online Guide to Effective Social and Emotional Learning Programs. And so they've done the research, so you don't have to do the research for you, and you can go through their database of programs that have been shown to be effective through randomized control trials, and how that translates to some of their social and emotional learning, but also to academic success as well. So you can think about perhaps the needs of your classroom or the needs of your school or student population, and then go through this guide as a first step in navigating some of those programs. And that would be my advice anyways, and again, starting that conversation about programs. So.
Great, and thank you so much for answering that, Colin, and for your participation with the question and answer session this time. Okay, so that's all the time that we have for today, so we're going to end our question and answer session at this time. So if you have any further questions, please email us at info@ld@school.ca or send us a tweet to @ld@school, and we will ensure that all your questions get answered. Public registration for LD at School's Educator Institute in August is now open. The Educators Institute is a bilingual conference that focuses on learning disabilities, and this year will be held on August 25th and 26th at the Hilton Mississauga Meadowvale Hotel and Conference Center. Presenters will include experts in the field of LDs from across Canada, including Dr. Colin King, who will be presenting one of the breakout sessions. As a delegate attending the Educators Institute, you will be provided with new perspectives and knowledge in the field of learning disabilities based on current research and practical information on effective assessment and instructional strategies, including technology. All Ontario educators who work hands-on with students with learning disabilities are encouraged to attend. For more information about this event, please visit our website at the link shown on the screen. Make sure to take advantage of the early bird pricing of $295 plus HST that is only available until May 29th. On behalf of the LD at School team, I would once again like to thank Dr. Colin King for his presentation, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us, as well as for your patience with the technical difficulties during this webinar. Please remember that we will be sending out presentation slides as well as a short survey following today's webinar. The feedback we receive through this survey provides us with important information for producing future webinars. Also remember that we will be sending out a link to this recorded webinar in approximately 3 weeks. Thank you again for participating in this LD at School webinar, and have a wonderful day.